Okay, so I'm going to unmute Joellen. For those of you guys who don't know, Joellen is my mom, and she's going to help me keep track of all your questions because I had trouble talking and keeping track of questions. And I'm also going to unmute Stephanie. Okay. Stephanie, can you talk?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay, Joellen, can you talk?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm right here.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm so glad to have all of you guys here. And we're going to talk today about the canter. I heard some of you guys already talking about fear of cantering, not wanting to ask for the canter, bad experiences that you've had at the canter. And these are real. I think we've all experienced these. So let's start with, I'm going to have Joellen tell us her canter stories.
Well, as many of you know, I learned to ride when Amelia went to college, and she gave me a horse, Scotty, which is a quarter horse. And I went to a clinic, and the clinician will remain nameless, but he said, well, Joellen, just go out and canter and show people how to do it. So I went off and I cantered a couple circles on Scotty. He is a very choppy canter. And I came back to the croup, and he said, he had the audacity to say, that is not a very good canter, and you're never, ever going to learn how to canter. And that's kind of the cowboy way of teaching you. And I got so mad. I was like, I am going to freaking learn to canter. So after that, I went out every day and cantered and cantered and cantered and cantered until I could connect my seat to the saddle. But sometimes instructors get frustrated and they just tell you like it is. And now, at least now he recognizes that I can canter.
Okay, Stephanie, do you have a canter story for us?
I'm trying to think. Yes, I do. So I've been riding since I was 7. And this was like shortly after I started riding. I was riding a little pony, and the teacher was teaching us how to do simple lead changes across the diagonal of the arena. And it was a jumping arena. So there were like 2 and 3 foot jumps set up. And so I took the pony across. We picked up the trot, but then I turned his head too much and he jumped over like a 2 foot fence. And I fell off. It was scary. And I have a quarter horse, also Joellen, and his canter's really crazy to the left. And currently still, although it's getting better. But he's taken off with me a couple times. So that's not fun.
Yeah.
Those are my only canter stories.
Okay, so my canter story is when I first started riding, I leased this horse named Indy, and we never cantered. We only walked and trotted. And that's like the worst thing ever. And my instructor one day decided that we were going to canter today. And so, of course, the horse bucked me off, and then I was afraid of cantering. But my point with this is that we all have canter stories about like when things go wrong or the horse takes off and bucks you off. And so I don't want any of you guys to think that you're alone for being afraid to canter or struggling with the canter. And it's also true that like when you get your canter good on one horse, getting on a new horse opens a whole new can of worms because every horse is very different in how you ask for the canter and in the motion for the canter. So just because you can canter one horse doesn't mean that you can canter other horses. Does anyone have a canter story that they want to share with us? If you wave or lift your hand, I can call on you. Let's see. On the right, Diane says, I had lots of green horses. Oh, Terrell, do you want to share with us a story? Okay, I'll unmute you. Hi, Terrell.
Hello, Amelia. Well, my canter story it's not a scary story or anything, but it has to do with the horse itself. And this is way back. Must have been about 15, and the lesson horse, his name was Casey, and he was not a beautiful horse to look at standing still. He was ewe-necked, he was goose-rumped, he was a funny looking horse. But yet that horse had the most beautiful canter. He was the most loveliest horse to watch in motion. And so learning my first canters on that animal was just kind of this priceless gift. And then when I would ride other horses, it's like, what?
Yeah.
But he was the funniest looking horse, standing still, and the most beautiful horse in motion. So that's my little canter story.
Oh, that's great. I love it. Okay, does anyone else have a canter story they want to share? Oh, Karen. Okay, Karen, let's hear it.
Well, my canter stories, I was lucky enough to get Corsica, who was an older Grand Prix horse. And I was down at Show Park showing my very first Prix St. George on her. And when we went across the diagonal, she went into 1 tempi changes, and I couldn't get her back to do 4s. So that was kind of interesting.
Well, that's a good canter story. I think a lot of people would wish to have that happen to them.
Well, it was kind of embarrassing at the time.
Okay. All right, so I have a few little slides to show you guys. I'm going to talk you through some slides, then then I'm going to show you a little video on the canter. Then Stephanie's going to talk to us, and Joelle's going to help moderate. Oh, then we'll do questions, but Joelle will help moderate if you have questions. So let me share my screen with you guys and find my presentation. Hang on a second. Okay, can you guys see everything?
Yes.
The canter. Okay, so first of all, this is a photo of the canter, and you can see this horse. So the canter is a 3-beat gait. You can see how in this picture, the horse has her outside hind leg on the ground. The next footfall is going to be the inside hind leg and the outside front leg land together. That's beat number 2. And then beat number 3 of the canter is the inside front leg hitting the ground. And then there's a suspension phase in the canter where all 4 feet are off of the ground. So that is the canter for us. This is Catalina that I'm riding here in this photo. So we're going to start with fear of the canter, because anyone that has ridden, including me, has fear when we canter. So I'm not afraid of cantering the horses that I know, but when I'm starting a young horse or when I go to Europe and try horses, cantering always brings an element of fear, because likely if things are going to fall apart, it's going to fall apart when you canter or when you ask for the canter. The walk and trot are usually pretty like manageable, but in the canter, things can fall apart. So break it down. That's the first thing. I've been asking people this week. I was asking my husband last night at dinner. I was asking him how he learned to canter. The best way to learn to canter is to learn on a lunge line. So if you can, get an instructor with a lunge horse that can put you on the lunge line and get to where you can canter without holding on to the saddle. That's the best way to learn how to canter. Another thing that I suggest to a lot of people, if you're afraid of cantering, is work on trotting faster and faster until you're basically trotting as fast as you'd be cantering. This is how, when I start a young horse, I basically just trot faster and faster until the horse naturally picks up the canter. It's when you're on a more trained horse, like you sit and you half halt and you collect the trot and then you canter. But sometimes it's easier to just trot faster and faster and just naturally go into canter. And that also helps you psychologically, that it's not like you're speeding up that much. Sometimes the speed is what scares the horse and the rider. Then breathing. This is a huge one, and really working on, I remember my first riding instructor, I still have her voice in my head, and she'd say, deep breath in, exhale, and ask for the canter. That's so important, is to give yourself that deep breath in, exhale, lower your center of gravity, ask your horse to canter. And then visualizing, of course, practicing it in your mind, you know, when you're going to sleep at night or driving to the barn, how it's going to feel when you ask for the canter. And getting help. This is a huge one. So if you have a horse that's like naughty when it canters, if you're afraid, if your horse bucks or runs off, you need to get help from a professional, someone that can help you, because we don't want to get hurt. Okay, the aids for canter. So as we talked about, the canter is a 3-beat gait. The universal aid for canter is your inside leg at the girth, your inside seat bone, and your outside leg behind the girth. That's the universal aid. But everyone's aid is a little different. The canter aid is like a very personal aid. It's different on every horse. Every rider does it a little differently. And because of this, like I said, when I'm trying a new horse, it always takes me a while to figure out what works for that horse. And then as far as influencing the canter, we'll get into this a little more later on. But I got a lot of questions before this, and people are asking about the horse being on the forehand. So it's important when you want to influence the canter that you half halt and ask for that half halt when the mane is flying up and when the hind legs are on the ground. Okay, so common mistakes in the canter. You can see in this picture here, this is actually a YouTube video that I did on how not to canter your horse. The most common thing I see are people that raise their hands up and lean forward when they ask for the canter. Another one that Stephanie's going to talk about is tightening up your hips and losing your stirrups. Sometimes we do this because we're afraid the horse is going to break, so we kind of clamp with our legs to try to keep the horse cantering and end up losing our stirrups. Not following the motion of the canter, or an incorrect lead. Okay, so the canter transition. This, again, a lot of people wrote in and asked me questions about the canter transition. Again, I have a video on how to work on the canter transition. Like we talked about last time, a lot of it is timing, balance, and feel. So feeling the right moment to ask for the canter, having the right balance of your seat, leg, and hand is super important in the canter transition, and it's different on every horse. Some horses require more of a half halt. Some horses require more of a kick with the outside leg. Some horses require more inside leg rather than outside leg, and that just takes time to figure out. The snowman exercise is one that I love for the canter. Again, I have a video on this, which I will send you guys after this. The leg yield into the canter is another great one. So I like to work on going up the quarter line, leg yielding the horse over to the rail. And then when you get to the rail, that's the perfect time to ask for the canter, because the leg yield gets your horse off of the inside leg and into that outside rein. Another great one is to do walk, trot, canter. So sometimes if you're just trotting around forever and ever and you ask your horse to canter, they're kind of just in trot around mode and they don't hear the aid for canter. So I like to do where I go walk, trot, walk a few steps, trot, walk a few steps, trot, and then right away to canter. Sometimes that helps if your horse is kind of lazy for the canter aid. I want to show you guys a great little video that I found on YouTube. And this video is Mary Wanloss. And she's a pretty famous instructor she works on rider biomechanics. So she's explaining in this video how to sit in the canter. How do you move your body with the canter? So let me see if I can get out of this screen and show you that. Let me stop this. How is everyone doing? Good? Good? Okay. Let me find this video for you guys. Okay, here it is.
While you're trying to get set up, Amelia, one of the questions from Cynthia is good, and that is that sometimes when she asks for the canter, her horse drops their neck and head, and that's the moment that she gets a little bit scared. I think I'm summarizing this right.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's always when your horse drops their head, they could buck. Like head goes down, sometimes that's a sign that they might buck. They might not, but they might. So if your horse wants to go down with their head when you ask for canter, you know, maybe think of pushing their hip a little bit out, trying to keep their poll up when you ask for the canter. And then also, like I said, just riding forward into the canter, like trotting forward, 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 keeping their poll up into the canter. Anything else, or should we watch the video?
There's one other question I'd like to ask. Janet asked for a repeat of the best aids for canter. If you could slow down and say that again, and how you breathe.
Okay, so the best aids for the canter, basically what you need before you ask for the canter is you need your horse to be off of the inside leg and into the outside rein. So they need to be like properly bending on the circle in your outside rein. And then what I do for the canter is I put my outside leg a little back and on, my inside leg at the girth, and then a little bit sitting on my inside seat bone for the canter aid. Do you have anything to add to that, Stephanie? Let me unmute you. I don't know why. Oh.
Sorry, I muted myself. My kids are yelling at me.
Do you have anything to add?
No, that's good. No.
Okay. Okay. I'll mute you again. Okay, so let me show you guys this video because I thought it was really well explained. Can you see the video screen, Mom? Thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay. So again, this is Mary Wanloss, and I hope you can hear her. Okay.
As trot.
Can you hear it?
People, you know, often don't quite come down and they bump basically like this.
Can you hear
When
it
people
okay?
go to canter, they bump like that.
Yeah.
Well, you can see the ball might go out behind me, and so might the horse. So some people's response to not being tipped is to go, you won't tip me, mate. You won't tip me forward. You won't tip me. You won't tip me. That's probably the majority of the population. Well, some of the rest of the population are going, oh, I'm tipping and bumping. I'm tipping and bumping. I'm tipping and bumping. And so we need to look at a couple of things. One is, can the rider keep the back of her butt down in the saddle? In trot, when people unsit, so if we say here's the horse and here's the rider, when people bump in trot, they bump level, like that. When people bump in canter, they tend to bump this way. So this rider is only attached by her pubic bone. This rider is attached back to her seat bones and the back of her butt bumps up. This rider is attached back to her tailbone. Okay, some riders are so determined they're going to stay attached at their tailbone that they end up going beat 1, beat 2, beat 3. And lots of people are taught this. So if you've been through Pony Club and at some point in time you've been taught polish the saddle with your bottom, this is what you've been taught. You've been taught to go beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3. There is a problem with this though. By the time we get to beat 3, if we go 1, 2, 3, at this point in time, the horse's weight is already on that leading front leg. And you as rider are going, your shoulders are back behind your pelvis inevitably is behind your knee, and lines of force are going shoulders to pelvis to knee to the horse's front feet. And you are in big danger of really being the water skier to his motorboat. So the more you go 1, 2, 3, the more likely he is to speed off with you, pull the rug out from under your feet, and go to boom down onto that front leg with a really big tip and rock. So what the rider's unwittingly doing at that point is emphasizing that third beat of the stride, which is the downbeat of the weight down on the front leg. And the emphasis goes there, the emphasis goes there, the emphasis goes there, the emphasis goes there. What works better and what we teach is really trying to get the emphasis on beat number 1. So what that means is instead of thinking of your pelvis going that way, you start to think of going, can you fold a little bit here, fold a little bit here, fold a little bit here. So this is happening on beat number 1. So I'm in a right rein position as if my horse would circle that way around towards that long side. This would be the outside hind leg. And I'm saying to the horse, it's the back leg. Wait the back leg, wait the back leg, wait the back leg. And that's happening on beat number 1, 1. And can you attach your underneath to her from further back in your underneath? Ah, good girl, she could. Keep attaching your underneath to her from further back in your underneath for your box.
Okay. Okay, so that's the video. And I thought this was kind of a good description. A lot of riders have difficulty following the motion of the canter because it's very different than the trot. Whereas the trot's kind of an up and down motion, the canter's more of a like a circular motion, like a rocking horse. And so you do, like Mary was mentioning, you need to connect your seat bones, your pubic bones, and you have to follow that motion without following too much. Like you don't want to end up, like she said, hyperextended with your hips in front of your shoulders, but you do need to close and open your hip angle. So I'm going to have Stephanie talk a little bit about how to use your body in the canter. For those of you guys that don't know, Stephanie is a physical therapist, and she works a lot with riders, specifically helping us understand how to use our bodies correctly in the saddle. All right, Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. So I like the video that Mary put out because I see that a lot in riders. And for those of you that don't know, I am the physical therapist for the Developing Dressage program for USEF. And I've studied under Andy Thomas, who's the team physical therapist for the United States. And he talks about that a lot, especially moving behind the vertical. And we usually see that for 2 reasons. Usually we see it a lot in riders, especially young riders that are really like loose in their joints and not as good of body control. What happens is they're following almost too much in their pelvis and their hips, and then their upper back follows. But I also see it in a lot of riders that are really stiff through their whole back. So the only way that they're able to follow the motion is their whole back goes behind the vertical. The other thing that I see, which Amelia showed in her video, and I think it was a really good demonstration, when we grip too much with our knees, so that's increasing the tightness of your adductors or your inner thigh, then what happens is it prevents your hip joint from being able to follow the motion. So the hip joint is stuck at more of a right angle than kind of being able to open and close through the motion. And then that's when you tip forward, is when you're gripping too much. Now, those of you that have a lot of fear with the riding, our natural tendency when we're scared, when we're riding, is to grip too much, I think, with our knees and hang on that way. And then that automatically puts all our weight forward. There was a comment earlier on the chat about putting too much weight forward. And I said on there, you know, our head weighs as much as a bowling ball. So it's automatically, like, that's a lot of weight forward, and our horses are super sensitive to that. So if we're already gripping with our knees and then our head comes forward and our whole trunk comes forward, then all of the force is put down on the forehand of the horse instead of back. And even though we need to hang on with our leg, I see a lot of overactivity in people's inner thigh, and it causes them to not be able to follow the motion correctly. I would say I see that more than somebody going behind the motion. I see people going behind the motion, like what Mary Wanless was saying about pushing and driving. I see that more, I would say, than somebody being kind of too floppy in the saddle and just falling out of the motion.
Yeah.
Stephanie, there are a couple questions.
Yes.
One of them are there exercises to get our hips to move more easily, and an exercise to loosen the lower back? So those are two questions.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about exercises or things you can do to loosen the hip. So I said what I find, and I'm just making more of a general statement because obviously everybody is different, but when your adductors are too tight, you have to think of the opposite muscle group to that, which is actually our hip external rotator. So adductors grab our knees in this way. We have a group of muscles called our abductors, but also our hip external rotators. So that helps open up the hip. Now, I'm not saying ride with your toes sticking out, but it's the opposite muscle group to the hip adductors. And if you were to go to a gym and you see an adductor machine, which is where you pinch your knees together, and then there's an abductor machine, but I usually don't typically recommend that for riders. And the reason is because you're sitting in a sitting position and your hip angle is already closed off while you're working the muscles. And I really like being more functional with exercises. So working those muscles, if you have bands, you could put them around your knees. You could stand in a mini squat and push your knees out. You could do it if you're sitting on a tall exercise ball so that your hips are a little bit open, you can kind of push out. So that is a way to strengthen the opposite muscles of your adductors. You can also stretch your adductor muscles. There's lots of great exercises for that. As far as getting to move your back, I like to think of it as moving your back segmentally. Most people, when their back becomes rigid, especially when they're following in the canter, they're using too much of their back extensor muscles, which are the ones that run up and down your spine in the back from the pelvis all the way to the neck. And those are two active. And then we talked a little bit last week, I think, about our transverse abdominal muscles. And the cool thing about those muscles is they wrap around from the side of the front of your trunk all the way around to the back and attach to your spine. So if we can get into each of those segments of your transverse abdominal muscles, as well as there's little tiny spinal rotator muscles. If we can get those to work together instead of our back using our back extensors, that also helps with being able to kind of unlock the back. That's the roll up and roll down exercise for those of you who have taken Amelia's class.
Yeah, no, those are all great exercises, and definitely the roll up and roll down, because in the canter, like my husband, there's actually another video on my YouTube of my husband cantering, and he was teaching my mom actually, and he said, keep your shoulders still and move your hips, because that's kind of in the canter, it's kind of like your shoulders stay in one position and your hips and your lower back have to kind of swish from the back to the front of the saddle and absorb the motion of the canter. And another really good way, if you're having trouble with the canter, is like get someone to lunge you on a horse. Like go to a riding school where they have lesson horses and see if you can find someone that can just lunge you on a horse and get to where you can hold on to the front of the saddle or a neck strap and get your seat just finding that motion, because that's huge.
And have somebody help you check with your stirrup length also. So I posted a photo on Instagram a couple days ago with me riding my young horse, and he has a really huge canter. And so I had a quarter horse before that, that's like 14 hands, so he's really little. Then I've gone to this 17 hand huge horse, and in my photo, I'm like, oh, I'm leaning forward. I just like can't even handle it, right? But today I was thinking, I videoed myself yesterday, and then today when I was riding, I'm like, I think my stirrups are too long. And I think a lot of people with too long of stirrups will sometimes, especially at the canter, because we have to balance on the horse, then they want to drop their knee a little bit and grip to stay on, because we don't want to fall off, and then that pitches you forward. So if your stirrups are too long and you shorten it a little bit, the cool thing is that it allows you, not that we want to force our heels down like jumpers necessarily, but when you're able to put a little bit more weight in your stirrup, it actually allows you to use those hip abductors and your hip external rotators a little bit more effectively than if your stirrups are too long.
Do we have more questions, Mom? Joellen?
Yes, there was a couple of comments about posting the canter that I thought were really interesting, and I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, if that's helpful or not.
On like half seat in the canter? Because you don't really post.
No, there's actually a discussion about, sometimes I post the canter and that helps me get oriented. It was by Janice.
Okay, maybe. Well, I mean, you can do half seat in the canter. You wouldn't call it, like, technically it wouldn't be called posting the canter, but sometimes, being up in a little bit of a half seat, and basically a half seat is like what you see the jumpers do, where your lower leg is connected, but there's a little bit of space between your seat bones and the saddle. And sometimes that can help to just allow the horse to start cantering, and then that your leg position is correct. And then gradually, once the horse is kind of in the rhythm of the canter, sometimes you can sit more back onto them. But that again is like, if you're having trouble finding that motion through your seat, then yeah, I can see how sometimes being in a little bit of a half seat can help, especially on a young horse or a horse that isn't super balanced in the
Well,
canter?
can I add to this?
Yeah.
Susan here. I
Hi.
used to play stick and ball in South America quite a lot, and everyone posts the canter in polo. It's a way to be able to move your arm to swing and hit the ball with the mallet,
Okay.
and still stay in motion with the horse cantering.
Yeah.
So that really helped me a lot, just because I'm more focused on hitting a ball than
Yeah.
I am on riding correctly, but you still have to ride correctly.
Right.
Otherwise, you're off your horse. So that's where my input to that discussion was that, yeah, that gave me a lot of confidence for future. Anyway, that's my input.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Really great. Who knew? So, but yeah, I mean, anything that can help you, obviously in dressage, you know, we want to get where we're sitting in the saddle and able to influence our horse, you know, like Mary was talking about. In dressage, we want our horse to get uphill balance, and so that means getting them to carry more weight on the hind leg. And like I talked about in the canter, giving those half halts when the mane is flying up, and getting your horse to carry more weight on the hind end is very important. Okay, we have a question over here. Which is the best moment to ask the horse to transition from canter from trot to canter during the suspension phase? So you want to ask your horse to canter when right as the outside hind leg is coming onto the ground. So usually if you're correctly asking for a canter transition, you should be in sitting trot. Your horse should be moving a little off your inside leg and into that outside rein. And then you're going to want to give a half halt when that outside hind leg is on the ground. And right after that, put your outside leg behind the girth, inside leg at the girth, and ask your horse for the canter. The horse has to push off of the outside hind leg in order to lift themselves into the canter. So that is the moment when you want to ask. I try not to overcomplicate that for people, because I think that that's a place where you can get kind of stuck too much in the details of it. I think more of just trying to feel a rhythm, that your horse is forward in the trot, that they're filling up your outside rein, that your upper body's back, and then asking for canter, rather than getting too wrapped up in the exact perfect millisecond to ask for the canter.
Jay is actually asking for the downward transition from canter to trot.
Canter to trot. So again, kind of the same thing. Like I was mentioning before, we're thinking of that uphill phase of the canter. So like I talked about, when your horse's mane is flying up, 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 that's when you want to half halt and ask the horse for the trot. You don't want to half halt when they're down on the front end, because then they're going to fall on the forehand into the trot. You want to half halt when the mane is flying up. I also like to think of pushing the horse a little out as you ask for the canter trot transition. So like a little shoulder forward, a little leg yield off of my inside leg. At that moment, when you ask for canter trot, that's going to help keep the uphill balance and keep your horse kind of packaged in that downward transition.
There's another question about the half halt. Is the half halt, can you describe it? Is it in both reins or is it in the outside rein?
That is a good question. Mostly it is the outside rein, but remember that your half halt is a balance between your seat, leg, and hand. So it's not just the rein. It's your seat. It's kind of tightening your lower abs. Like in the canter trot, again, here's what I do for the canter trot. I think of breathing a deep breath in and exhaling. When I'm exhaling, it's lowering my center of gravity. It's putting a little more weight on my seat bones. I'm tightening a little bit my lower abs so that instead of like swishing with the canter motion, I'm moving a little bit less at that moment. Then I'm adding a little half halt with my outside rein, but I'm never just pulling. So a half halt is like half halt, give, half halt, give. It's never just like pull back on 2 reins to get the horse to canter or to trot from the canter. I hope that answers the question.
There's another question, which is how, how to get the best balance in the canter so you're not inadvertently getting flying changes. Like, what do you do if you're on a horse that changes all the time?
Okay, if you are on a horse that wants to do flying changes all the time, this can be caused by several things. One of them is like if the horse prefers one lead or the other, like if they only want to canter on the left lead. If the horse is out of balance, sometimes they'll swap leads. If the horse is behind the leg, sometimes they'll swap leads. Sometimes horses will swap leads only in the hind. Like if they're kind of, again, if they lose their balance, sometimes they'll cross canter and drop a lead behind. The best way to work on this is I like to start off on a circle. So always, like if I'm on a young horse, I always start off cantering on a circle, because when you're on a circle, it's less likely that the horse is going to be able to change leads. And then mix in like little straight lines where you go a little straight and then go off onto a circle again, go a little straight, go off onto a circle again. Sometimes if the horse is swapping leads behind because they're behind the leg, you need to just like send them forward and make them change back onto the correct lead. If they won't change back onto the correct lead, then you can trot, but keep them going forward, right back into the canter as quick as possible. I love this Diane Child comments. If your horse wants to do flying changes all the time, tell it to me. Oh my God.
There was a question earlier about what happens if your horse like loses the canter, or you lose the canter when you're cantering. And I think it's important to know or figure out if the horse has stopped cantering because your seat is telling it to stop cantering versus the horse being naughty, so or being lazy. So I recently had quite a lot of time off from riding and then went back to riding, and having a young horse that's a little, I'm not going to say he's lazy, but kind of, I don't know. Anyway, I'm figuring him out still. But he broke into the trot, and I asked my instructor, I said, what do I do when I have him at home and he does this? Do I go right back and make him can't pick up the canter? Because I didn't ask him. And she said, well, you did, your seat did. And that's because my fitness level wasn't up to par yet as in keeping him in the canter. And so I think it's important to realize when you're getting tired in your seat and you're still asking the horse to canter, I think it's important to recognize that and ask them for a downward transition before they lose the canter, and then it can create other issues. What do you think about that, Amelia?
No, I think, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's definitely, it's two things. It's making sure that, you're following. And then it also, brings on the point of getting your horse in front of the leg in the canter, which I think is a huge one for a lot of people. Like I mentioned earlier, you're so afraid that the horse is going to break that you clamp all the time instead of let your leg hang, let your hip be free and follow the motion, and then feel when you need to give like a quick little bump with your leg, and then release your leg again. So yes. Okay, we have a question here from Melody. Melody, you mentioned earlier to let a horse trot really fast to go into canter. How long would you recommend letting your horse do this? So thank you, Melody. That is such a good question. So this method of just trotting faster and faster until your horse canters is not a dressage way of asking the horse to canter. This is just a good way if you have a green horse, if your horse gets really, or you get really tense in the canter, it's a good way of kind of just gradually doing it, like just trotting faster, trotting 2 miles an hour faster, getting comfortable, trotting faster, getting comfortable until your horse naturally takes the canter. Like if your horse is in the field, that's how they pick up the canter. They trot faster and faster and they canter. They don't like trot, rock back on their hind leg, pick up the canter. So once you and your horse are relaxed with picking up the canter this way, then yeah, absolutely. I would start trying to put the horse more together and focusing on like keeping the horse on the bit, making a half halt, not letting the horse just run faster into the canter, because certainly that's not what I want. I don't want my horse to run faster into the canter, but sometimes that's just a good way to help riders and horses get confidence in the transition. Who wants to ask a live question? I'm feeling bored. Wave to us if you want a live question. Do you see anyone that, oh, Terrell wants to ask us another question. Hi, Terrell.
Hello, thank you. I have a question. I have been reading a book about biomechanics in dressage, and I've just started it. And so could you explain the concept of the spiral seat versus, say, independent seat? Are they one and the same? I'm assuming it's not the same as the swivel seat. So that's my question.
I don't know. Stephanie, have you heard of the spiral seat?
Yeah, I think what they're talking is that, which book is it?
Gee, it's a spiral bound handbook. Has lots of really great illustrations of human and equine skeletons.
When
and
it's
drawing.
talking about the spiral seat, does it give like a spiral going up the rider's back? Like their spine?
No, not a spiral like that. It's mainly just talking about the abdominal and transverse muscles acting as a stabilizer, kind of like one of those Chinese finger things. And I was just, and
from my perspective and what I'm hearing, when we, I'll back up a minute. When you want a horse to turn, it's important to use your abdominal muscles. So someone was asking what their abs should be doing during the canter, but we'll just use this kind of in general. When you're turning, your abdominals, so your obliques on one side are pulling this way, the other side are a little bit relaxed, but have tone in them. And what happens in your spine is your spine turns just a little bit going down, and that your spine connects to your pelvis, which is where your seat bones are. So when that turns a little, you have a little bit of turn in your seat.
Right.
And, so I think that's what maybe that they're talking about. Mm-hmm. You want to be able, I see a lot of riders when they think of this though, is they end up turning and collapsing. Yeah. So you maintain that uprightness and that side that you're turning towards to get that translation through your
right.
Now we're not like turning and looking so far, but it's a subtle motion in your abdominal muscles on that side. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does, because I've always been taught that when you're turning in whatever gait, you're turning basically your core in the direction you want to go, because yourself, what you're doing, your horse reflects, and vice versa.
Right.
That really helps.
What's cool too is when you think of it that way, when you turn, like if you guys are sitting in a chair and you slowly turn to the right, if you were thinking of a horse being underneath you, what it allows is for your inside leg, so that right leg, to kind of be horse a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's what it's talking about.
Okay.
I'm going to answer the question about the abs. What should your abs be doing during the canter? And I think that they need to be turned on, but not rigid. So you shouldn't be like bearing down with your abs, but you should be able to use them and then turn them off, and then use them and turn them off. And like Amelia said, when she's doing her half halt for a downward transition, you use your abdominal muscles to prevent your back from moving and to prevent your hip joints, your pelvis from following a little bit. So you're kind of lifting up. And what happens is when you can lift up with those transverse abdominal muscles, is that it allows the horse in that downward transition, it allows the horse to come up in there where there's two, because you're not in their way collapsing. But it's a way to get your body to slow down its movement just a little bit. Does that answer your question, Jenny?
Okay, let me, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for answering that spiral question, because I learned something new. It's super interesting. Okay, so we had a question on the right. I was reading about a horse what to do when your horse hollows and pops their head up and kind of gets tense and goes fast into the canter. I think this happens with a lot of people, where you feel like your trot's really good and the horse is really round and relaxed, and you ask for canter and it's like everything falls apart. The horse's head goes up, their back hollows, they get tense, they run off with you. So a few things that I think will help with this. The first thing is, if your horse pops up in the transition and hollows, I always try to think about making my horse a little bit extra round before I ask for the canter. So making them like a little extra round and deep. And then sometimes prioritizing, not like my horse needs a canter right now, but I'm going to let the transition take a little longer. Maybe the horse doesn't need to canter the instant I ask, and keep that horse nice and round in the transition so that you start off with your horse round enough. Then if as you're going in the canter, the horse starts to get like more and more tense and hollow and running off, for one, I hope that you're on a circle, because staying on a circle is going to help you keep your horse bending, keep your horse round, keep your horse under control. But if your horse gets more and more tense, then I would go back to the trot, try to get that relaxation and that roundness again, get your horse nice and deep, and then kind of take your time going into the canter. We had another question that was talking about horses that get tense in the canter. And this is a hard one, because sometimes like you'll find horses that like the walk and the trot feel really nice and relaxed, and you go to the canter and you just feel the horse holding their breath, getting faster and faster, unable to balance and kind of stay relaxed. So again, that exercise that I just mentioned with like going back to trot, getting the horse relaxed, going up to the canter again. Some of it's just repetition. Horses are creatures of habit. So the more that you canter every day and just make it not a big deal, the more they're going to get relaxed about it. And the
more you're going to get relaxed about it too.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing, because the horses are so perceptive of us, and if they feel us tensing our muscles, holding our breath, our heart racing, they for sure are going to pick up on that. Another thing, if your horse gets tense in the canter, or if they hollow, is sometimes lunging them a little with side reins. I'm not a huge fan of lunging, but if you're really struggling and that's something that you can do, and just teach your horse to relax their back and canter over their back on the lunge line without a rider, that can help. And then of course, if your horse gets really tense and you're really tense, get a trainer and have a trainer canter your horse. Like, I can't emphasize that enough. Like, don't be stubborn about like, I'm going to do this and I know better. If you're tense at the canter, put someone on your horse that isn't tense, that can give your horse confidence, and watch that person ride your horse, because if you can see someone else ride your horse and canter your horse, it's going to help you get more confidence that you can do it.
One thing, Amelia, when you were little and you were having all your lessons from Julie, one thing that I go back and remember when I'm riding by myself is Julie always made you canter both to the right and to the left. No lesson was ever complete or finished until you cantered both directions. And I think that helps people relax in the canter and give them confidence that you just canter every lesson, every time you ride.
Okay, who else has a question? Someone wave at me. Who wants to ask a question? Oh, Michaela. Okay, I'm unmuting you, Michaela. Hi, Michaela.
Okay. Hi, Amelia. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So, can you talk about what we're supposed to be doing with our hands when we're cantering?
Okay, with your hands. Yes, this is a good question. So for those of you guys that were here last week, when we talked about rider position, and I talked about that straight line from your elbow to your horse's mouth. So that needs to stay in alignment. Like I mentioned in my little speech, a lot of people's hands go up. So suddenly their hands are way up here, and that straight line from elbow to mouth is no longer there. Now, it's more complicated though in the canter, because in the canter, the horse has a motion to their head. So in the trot, the horse's head is pretty still, but in the canter, there's a nodding motion. So as the horse is cantering, the horse is going up and down a little bit with their head. And so your elbows have to follow that motion. So let me see if I can show you my elbows. So when you're cantering, your arms are a little bit doing this. So your arms are a little bit following the motion of the horse's head. So as you're cantering, and this a little bit comes from your upper body moving and your hips, all right? Your hips are swishing with the canter and your shoulders are staying more still. Like I said earlier, your shoulders stay still and your hips move in the canter. So your elbows are a little bit following that motion. What this allows is it allows for you to have a steady contact with the horse's mouth. This is so, so important, because you need to have a steady contact on the bit to give your horse security. So it's not pulling on them. It's not abandoning them and throwing the contact at them. You should have, it should be like if you're holding a kid's hand and you're giving them that confidence to cross a busy street, that's how it should feel with your horse's mouth, that you have a little feel of their lips, that you're supporting them in the motion of the canter. It should not be like you're dropping the contact and then smashing them in the mouth with a bit. So yeah, that's everything your hand should be doing in the canter. And then also, you know, like I said earlier, you still have that feeling of the horse staying off your inside leg. You should have a little bit more contact in your outside rein than in your inside rein. So your horse is staying off the inside leg and into that outside rein. And okay, your shoulders. So someone here, Jan, asked about what your shoulders should be doing in the canter. So again, you want to maintain that nice posture with your shoulder blades pulled together. Your shoulders, you don't want to be like swaying a lot forward and back in the canter. You should maintain that nice alignment between your ear, shoulder, hip, and heel. Do you have anything to add to that, Stephanie?
No, just when it's funny that we're talking about this, because I noticed this in my ride yesterday, and I videoed it and then I practiced today. Yesterday I realized I wasn't following enough in the canter, and that was causing me to not be able to sit upright. So if my elbows are too rigid and I'm too tight here in my chest, then when he goes on the downbeat, that pulls me forward because I'm not letting the reins slide out of my hand each beat. So it's important to think about too, what's pulling you forward? Is it because you're gripping with your knees, or is it because you're being too rigid in your upper body? The other thing that we see a lot is tightness too much in the pec area, which collapses you forward this way as well and can bring your head forward. And in order to get your shoulder blades back and together in the back, you have to make sure the front is not overactive, and then you have to make sure that the back of your shoulders are more active, and that's what gets you in that really good alignment.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to call on Carmen. I'm going to unmute her because she has a good question. Hi, Carmen.
Hi. Hi there. Sorry.
Hello.
Hello. Just okay. Thank you. I was with my family in the living room, so please excuse me.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I wasn't waiting an answer or a call, so I'm all surprised.
Hello.
Hi there. Hi there. So I have a young horse, a 9-year-old Spanish horse.
Uh-huh.
And I've been struggling for a while with the canter transition, as my teacher is just saying, okay, you have to pull quickly and then deepen your seat. And I get so confused sometimes that I stop hearing all that she's telling me, and I'm like, okay, God, please help me, because I don't know how to do this. So could you please explain a little bit to it?
Yeah, I will. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Okay, so for those of you guys that couldn't hear, Carmen has a question about the canter walk canter transition and how to introduce that to a young horse. So these canter walk canters are where you start teaching your horse to collect the canter. And teaching your horse to collect the canter is a challenging, but also a super important piece of dressage training. So when I introduce these, usually I start with the walk to canter because those are easier than the canter to walk. And the way I introduce the walk canter is I do where I, instead of doing like a lot of trot, I'll do walk, a few steps, trot, canter. And then gradually I just do less and less trot steps. So I'll go like walk, 1 step, trot, canter, until it just becomes that you can go walk, half halt, pick up the canter. And then Carmen was asking a little more about your downward transition. So the canter to walk, this can be really hard because what happens is, say you pick up the canter nice from the walk, you start out with a nice collected canter. What happens is the longer you canter, the more strung out and forward and fast your horse gets. And then you think, okay, you're cantering, how are you ever going to manage getting back to the walk? What I like to do is I like to use a 10-meter circle to prepare my horse for the walk transition. And then I'll ask the horse to canter like right when you're coming to the wall. So you'll be cantering along, you're gonna do a 10-meter circle. Right when your horse's head is like aiming at the wall, you're gonna ask the horse to walk. And that's gonna help give your horse a physical boundary to get them to walk. Another thing that I think is helpful is that expect that your horse is going to trot a few steps and then walk. And that's okay to start with. So, you know, if you're cantering and you come back to the wall, you may get a few trot steps, but as quickly as you can go to the walk. if you feel like your horse is really running through you, you can halt. Like once you're at the trot or the walk, you can halt, rein back one step, pick up the canter again, and then repeat where you make your 10-meter circle, come back to the rail, try to get your horse to walk from the canter. If they don't, then halt and rein back one step. I'm trying to think what else is helpful. Definitely make sure with your body position that you're sitting back, because often what happens is when you make that half halt, which as Carmen said, her instructor tells her it is kind of a quick like little, hey, you need to walk now. Like it is kind of a quicker half halt, coupled with the fact that your horse is slowing down, it's going to throw us forward. So make sure that you're really sitting back as you ask for that transition. Okay, who else has a question that they want to ask me? Anyone? Does anyone want to wave to me and I will answer, unmute them? Oh, Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I was actually seconding a question that's on there from Sue Cabay, and that is when the horse anticipates.
Okay.
Trying to keep them from going, I know, and running or going ahead, rather than listening to what you're saying and going step by step. So I guess her question, what are you going to do when the horse gets so excited they just start doing it again? Is that a nervousness thing for them, or is it that they're just really energized and they really want to, we're having fun here?
Yeah. That is a good question. And, the hard part, like with everything in dressage, is that it a little bit depends. Hang on one second. Sorry, I was doing some meeting work there. So definitely, like, part of dressage is getting your horse on the aids, which means that your horse on the aids means that your horse is ready for whatever you're asking, but they're also waiting. So if your horse is anticipating and they want to canter when you're not ready, you should wait until your horse is waiting and listening before you ask them to canter. So if your horse, like say you cantered and you're trotting and your horse really wants to canter again, some things that I would do is I would do some bending lines, some circles, maybe some serpentines, sometimes changing direction. Like say you've been doing trot, canter, trot on the left lead, and your horse is now thinking that that's what we're doing and they're wanting to anticipate the left lead canter. Sometimes changing direction and going to the right, or doing a serpentine or a leg yield, but mixing it up. But definitely if your horse is anticipating, you want to wait to feel them relax and wait for you, and then ask for the canter. If your horse is anticipating, you also want to think about why this is. And sometimes it's because maybe your aids aren't clear enough. So you need to then really think in your mind, okay, what is my trot aid? What is my trot seat? Versus what is my canter aid? And be really clear about that in your mind, and also clear with your horse when you're asking for trot and when you are asking for canter. All right, other questions? Let's see. Do you see any other questions, Joellen?
There's the one that I was taught to ride by grouping my knees on the saddle, and I'm a little confused about how much leg and parts of the leg to help me sit the canter. It's from Cynthia.
Oh, that's a very good question. And I do, last week, for those of you guys that were here, I read that little excerpt from the USDF manual. So your knees are supposed to be in the saddle. We don't want to see your knees flopping out of the saddle, but you don't want to be gripping with your knees either. And this is kind of a new concept to me, but Stephanie's talked about it, and it's more about using like your outer upper thigh muscles to keep, and your glutes to keep your leg in the saddle, as opposed to your inner thighs. If you grip with your inner thighs, that pushes your butt out of the saddle, versus if you use your outer thigh and your glutes, that keeps you in the saddle. As far as the canter, when you're cantering, your inside leg, it should be at the girth, and your outside leg should be a little behind the girth. Especially those of you guys that have horses that know flying changes or tempi changes, it's really important to have your outside leg all the time a little behind the girth. And this doesn't mean that your outside leg is like gripping on the horse, like that your spur is all the time on the horse, but you should have your inner calf at the girth and your outer calf behind the girth. You should have contact with your calf, but not with your heel all the time. Do you have anything to add to that, Stephanie?
Yeah, there's a difference, like Amelia said, between having your knee in the saddle or on the saddle and actively squeezing to try and not fall off. In physical therapy, we call it tone. So your adductors and your hamstrings should have some tone in them. So they should be on, but you're not actively using them. And in order, Amelia, to give the leg aid correctly, do you teach like upper calf first, right?
Yeah, upper calf, then your heel.
Right. So in order to get your upper calf on more, then that actually comes from your hip external rotators. They're really small muscles, and honestly, most people don't use them enough. So your adductor muscles are bigger muscles than your hip external rotators. So that's why when you are overactive or there's too much tone in your adductor muscle, which is your inner thigh, then when you go to try and get your leg aid on correctly, you end up hiking your leg up, and you're not as effective because those muscles aren't overtaking what your adductors are doing. Does that make sense? So they need to be on, they just don't need to be actively working and gripping. They are on because they're a stabilizer and we need it for stability, but that's not how we get the correct aids.
Good. Okay, we have a question here from Excalibur's Keeper about the flying change. Yay, I'm happy. Okay, tips to get my mare to wait for me to ask her for the flying change. So flying changes are, for those of you guys that have ever taught a horse the flying changes or ridden a flying change, it's like an amazing moment when your horse does a flying change on your aid. It's like really incredible to think that you can ask and a split second later your horse switches all four legs and does the change. It takes a long time, but it's also typical that when you're teaching a horse and when you're learning, that the horse will start to anticipate the flying change, because they'll feel you kind of start to set them up and change the flexion a little and push them off that new leg, and they'll start hopping in the canter and getting super excited, and then sometimes they'll change before your legs change. So what tells the horse when to do the flying change is that your legs switch position. So like I was talking about in the canter, in left lead canter, your left leg is at the girth, your right leg is behind the girth. When you ask for a flying change, you have to switch your legs. So from left lead to right lead, your left leg goes back and your right leg comes forward. If your horse is not waiting for you to do a flying change, that's not a good thing. So first off, you need to check your position. You need to make sure that your legs have not changed position. So long as your legs don't change position, the horse shouldn't change lead. If your horse is anticipating, don't ask. So if I feel a horse start to get tense and like hopping up and down and want to do a flying change, say I'm on the diagonal, I'm gonna hold the counter canter and I'm gonna make them wait for that flying change. If the horse does the flying change without me asking, I'm going to walk, and then I'm going to pick up the lead that I was on. So it's important that you don't make the horse change back, but instead walk. A couple of reasons why this is important is because when you bring them back to the walk, you recollect them and you re-get them back on the hind leg. And then it's also important that you don't make them do a flying change back to the other lead, because then they're thinking, oh, yay, I get to do flying changes. So that's the biggest thing, is just make sure your leg position is correct and don't ask until your horse is waiting. And when they are waiting for you, kind of a reward is like, if they are waiting for you and letting you set them up, then go ahead and ask them for the canter. Okay. Who else has a question? If someone wants to wave to me, we can answer a few more. No one? Oh, Kathy. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, the knee thing was good, and the thigh thing. I'm trying to figure out too how to keep my balance in the saddle and not make sure I come out of the saddle. And I know I tend to lose my stirrups a lot. Can you talk about ankles and feet joints? And are you sinking your weight down in the stirrup into your heels at certain times during that canter?
Yes. Okay. This is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. So a lot of riders lose their stirrups in the canter. And I think part of this is because, like I talked about, the horse isn't in front of the leg, so they're gripping, or they're trying to hang on. When I'm cantering, there is flex in my ankle joints. So every time the horse's front legs hit the ground, that's the downbeat of the canter. Both my ankle joints sink a little down. So it's like down, down, down as I'm cantering. And then you also have a joint in your foot, like where your toes connect to the ball of your foot. So that you have a little bit of a bend there, and that also helps you keep your stirrups. So yeah, definitely your ankles. I'm trying to think, some good exercises to help you keep your stirrups are, again, lunging, if you can get someone to lunge you. And cantering without stirrups is another great one, because it will force you to really keep your legs long.
Well, and the cool thing too, Amelia, is like last week I said, when you're able to get your heel down, they've done a lot of studies on the glute med muscle, which is really how we sit really well and even in the saddle. And if you're able to get your heel down a little bit, it actually allows you to access that muscle better, and therefore letting you sit better. So it's important to be able to let your heels come down a little bit in the canter.
Okay, anyone else? 2 more questions. I don't see anyone. No one else has questions?
Carmen just sent on the chat.
I can't read it anymore. What does it say? Can you read it?
Yeah, she says, my horse
read it.
My horse finds it really easy to correct the canter by himself. And when I want to ask him to maintain the canter on the diagonal without changing from left to right hand, for example, it's difficult because he maintains it for a couple strides, but then he changes leads. What aids should I use?
So it's still, like I said, if they're anticipating, then you need to just walk and pick up that counter canter and get them to wait. And then if you can, like at that moment when they're waiting, ask for the flying change. But yeah, you have to just keep repeating it until they're honestly waiting for you. Okay, I think we have Galaxy Tab. I don't have your name, but you're wearing a pink sweater. Do you want to ask a question? Hello? Hi.
Hi.
Yes, you. I can't see your name. I'm sorry. What's your name?
Alexa wins.
Hi, Alexa.
Good to see you.
Good to see ya.
This is fun.
Oh, good.
I was wondering, my instructor's always saying my hip flexors are tight with the canter and all. Can they explain kind of a little more maybe what he means? And I do Pilates and stretching those help, but I'm not understanding how they affect my seat and all.
That sounds like a Stephanie question.
Yeah, so I've heard a lot of instructors use that terminology with riders, and I would like to rephrase what he's saying. So I would like to say your hip flexors are overactive instead of tight. So when you are, and it could be related, you may be one of those that are overactive again in your adductor muscles, so your inner thigh. So when your inner thigh is overactive, then what happens is it causes your hip flexors to become overactive, which makes your hip angle. So here's your trunk and here's your hip. So we're sitting here and we want to follow like this in the canter, but if your adductors are too tight and your hip flexors are overactive, it kind of holds you here in this pitched forward position. Yeah, and then I find people overstretch their hip flexors, and anatomically, I'm not going to go into depth about it, but anatomically speaking, your hip flexors really are not that big of a muscle at the hip joint, and where they're attached, the forces are opposite. So I found, like I said, more people are overactive in their hip flexors than they are tight. And what happens is it's an opposite muscle group to your glutes and those hip external rotators. So if those are active, if your adductors are active, then you can't access the correct hip muscles to get your leg aid on.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, we have one. I'm going to answer one more question from Katie. Do you have advice for building horse stamina in canter? I have a horse who's off for a while and now is kind of a noodle in the canter. Is it more important to canter for longer periods of time or do more transitions? So definitely transitions. This is a great question. Your horse gets strength by doing transitions. So every time when they make a trot canter or a walk canter transition, they have to engage their hind leg and push off of their hind leg and use their back into the canter. So definitely don't just, and this applies to everyone, don't just canter around until your canter goes bad. Get quality over quantity. So canter a half a circle, trot, get your horse round, get it all set up again, canter, build up your confidence and your horse's confidence by doing shorter segments of high quality and really focusing on the transitions. The transitions are where all your problems are going to show up. So when you ride a dressage test, the transition is a separate score. So like in training level, for example, you pick up the canter, that's one score. You get one score for your entire canter circle. So in dressage tests, the transitions are very highly weighted because that's where all of your flaws show up. Okay, everyone, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us.
Thanks for letting me join you.
Yay. I think we're going to keep doing these on Sunday, at least I am. I haven't thought of a topic for next week. If any of you guys have suggestions, email me. And hopefully we will see you next week at noon, Sunday. Do you have any wrap-up comments, Joellen?
No, I thought it was great.
Thank you for being my secretary.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Amelia
Thank
and
you.
team. Thank you.
Hi.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Zelda. It was good to see you.
We really enjoyed it.
Apparently
It's
she's still
great.
on.
Okay, good. I'm unmuting
Still on my
everyone.
screen, should be.
If any of you have any final goodbyes to say.
Love
Thank you
it.
so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Lori.
Very much.
Bye,
Lori.
Lori.
you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye, Sylvia.
Nice jacket.
Okay, end meeting. Goodbye.